When you look at the label on your shirt, or maybe the wrapper on that chocolate bar you might be eating right now, you usually assume something pretty fundamental.
Right. You assume they know where it came from.
Exactly. You assume the brand whose name is stamped in big, bold letters right there on the packaging actually knows who made it. You picture an executive somewhere who has, a complete map of their operations.
Hmm.
But the reality is they probably have absolutely no idea.
Yeah, it is a massive systemic blind spot. And I mean, the deeper you look into how everyday products are actually made, the more you realize that the global economy is largely running in the dark.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are exploring the hidden mechanics and really the human cost of global supply chains.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. And we're basing today's conversation on some brilliant source material, specifically research out of the Henley Business School from Professor Mikhail Kostela.
Which is fantastic research, by the way.
Oh, it really lays out exactly why a company's biggest financial risks and its biggest human impacts lie completely outside its own walls. So our mission today is to uncover why those comforting certified labels often fail.
And they fail a lot.
Yeah, and how a new wave of global laws is forcing corporations to finally, map their blind spots. So let's jump right in. To understand how a multinational brand can be functionally blind to its own products, we have to look at how modern production is actually structured.
Right. And if you are familiar with environmental reporting, you might know the term Scope 3.
The emissions thing.
Exactly. It refers to all the indirect carbon emissions happening up and down a supply chain, which usually dwarfs a company's direct footprint. So Professor Kostela's research takes that exact framework and applies it to social impact and human risk.
That makes perfect sense. So just like the carbon footprint, the human footprint is sitting out there in the chain. I mean, the people actually extracting the raw materials or assembling a firm's products outnumber its direct employees many times over.
Oh, absolutely. And almost none of them actually work for the brand, which is how production gets fractured into these tiers.
Right, the tier system.
Yeah, so if tier 1 is the final assembly, like the factory putting the garment together or packaging the product, the brand usually has decent visibility there. I mean, they write the checks directly to that factory.
But the visibility plummets the second you move upstream.
It drops off a cliff.
Uh-uh.
Because tier 1 buys fabric or components from tier 2. Then tier 2 buys refined materials from tier 3. And eventually you hit the raw extraction, the informal farms, the remote mines.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because it essentially operates like a massive global game of telephone.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, so the brand is holding the receiver at one end in, say, London or New York, but the order has been passed through thousands of unlisted subcontractors. So the people at the very beginning of the line, the farmers and the miners, are completely invisible to the brand.
Completely invisible.
So how do you even begin to manage a workforce you can't even see?
Well, what's fascinating here is that you've hit on the fundamental rule of supply chain management. You cannot manage what you cannot map.
Right.
Supply chain governance isn't about having a benevolent corporate culture in your headquarters. It is a raw problem of information asymmetry and really leverage.
Because the further away you get, the worse the data gets.
Exactly. And the higher the risk becomes. The brand is ultimately a customer, not an employer. They can demand compliance, sure, but they lack direct operational control over those distant nodes.
And because those deepest tiers operate in the absolute dark, they become breeding grounds for the most severe labor abuses. The scale of this is just staggering. We are looking at an estimated 50 million people in modern slavery today.
It's a horrific number.
It really is. Just let that sink in for a second. That is about 1 in every 150 people on Earth.
Furthermore, this generates an estimated $236 billion in illegal private economy profits every single year.
Wow. Wait, 236 billion?
Yeah, and we are not talking about state-imposed labor camps in distant regimes. The vast majority of this is happening right in the private sector. It's woven into the supply chains of the ordinary consumer goods you and I buy every day.
That's incredibly unsettling. And it affects kids, too, right?
Oh, deeply. There are 3.3 million children currently in forced labor, and that is heavily concentrated in agriculture and mining, which is exactly that tier 3 and beyond that we were just talking about.
I want to dig into the mechanics of why this happens, because a lot of brands will defend themselves by saying, well, we ensure our suppliers pay the legal minimum wage.
Right, you hear that all the time.
But that seems to gloss over a massive economic reality in sourcing countries, which is the gap between a legal minimum wage and a living wage.
And that gap is the engine of the entire crisis. A statutory minimum wage is often kept artificially low by developing nations, mostly because they're trying to attract foreign manufacturing contracts.
So it doesn't reflect the actual cost of living at all.
Not even close. A living wage, on the other hand, is calculated based on the actual local cost of a basic, decent standard of living. So we're talking a nutritional food basket, modest housing, healthcare, schooling, and maybe a tiny margin for emergencies.
So when the legal minimum wage falls drastically short of that living wage calculation, families just face a permanent deficit.
Exactly. And when a household is running a permanent deficit, the adults have to take out predatory loans just to buy food. Or worse, they have to pull their kids out of school to work the fields.
Which means closing that living wage gap is really the single most effective intervention point.
Without a doubt, household poverty is the root cause here. Without addressing the underlying economics, any corporate policy that simply bans child labor is really just fighting the symptoms.
Which brings up something I really want to challenge, because when we hear the phrase forced labor, we naturally picture something cinematic, like chains, locks, armed guards.
Right, the Hollywood version.
Yeah. But if forced labor is actually much more insidious, like debt bondage or a supervisor confiscating a worker's passport, how would a standard one-day factory auditor ever catch that?
Well, the short answer is they wouldn't.
They just wouldn't see it.
No, because these abuses are highly sophisticated.
Yeah.
They are specifically designed to evade shallow tick box audits.
Right.
If a factory manager knows an external auditor is arriving on a Tuesday, well, the passports are locked in the manager's personal safe. The double ledger books hiding the debt bondage are moved off-site. And the factory floor looks perfectly compliant for those 8 hours.
It's just a total illusion.
A total illusion. And this is exactly why a brand waving a piece of paper saying, hey, our suppliers passed a minimum wage audit is a remarkably weak defense.
Because fully compliant suppliers can still pay poverty wages.
Exactly. Yeah. They pay poverty wages that trap workers in cyclical debt, which effectively creates modern slavery right under an auditor's nose.
Okay, so we've established the human cost here. But historically, moral arguments just haven't been enough to overhaul global supply chains. Sadly, no. So what is actually forcing the change right now is pure financial self-interest. Like, financial markets and corporate boards are waking up to the fact that this darkness is a massive existential business risk.
Oh, absolutely. When a board looks at this, they are staring down 4 distinct types of risk.
Okay, let's hear them.
First is operational. So if there's a catastrophic factory fire or a massive strike due to unsafe conditions, your supply stops dead. You have no inventory.
Makes sense.
Second is reputational. A scandal gets linked to your brand, trust evaporates, and consumers just walk away.
Right.
Third is legal. We are seeing liability increasingly piercing the corporate veil and moving all the way up the chain to the parent firm.
Which is terrifying for a board.
Exactly. And fourth is regulatory, which involves governments stepping in to seize goods outright at the border.
And there is actually a documented financial upside to getting this right, isn't there?
Yes, there is. Research shows U.S. firms on best companies to work for lists earned a premium of about 2.3 to 3.8% a year over a 25-year period compared to their peers.
Wow, that adds up.
It really does. Strong social governance actually correlates with lower interest rates on corporate debt and much better resilience during macro crises.
But the downside risk is where the real shockwaves happen. I mean, take the Rana Plaza disaster in 2013.
That was a pivotal moment.
A garment factory complex in Bangladesh collapsed, and 1,134 workers died. They were sewing clothes for major global brands, and that tragedy fundamentally rewrote the risk calculus for the entire apparel industry.
Yeah, because brands suddenly realized that the old defense of, well, we didn't own that factory, offered zero protection.
Right.
Once your logo is literally pulled from the rubble by international journalists, distance is no longer a shield against market outrage or plummeting stock prices.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The danger of distance isn't just about geography. The Boohoo case study from 2020 perfectly illustrates this.
Oh, the Boohoo case is wild.
Because Boohoo is a fast fashion brand headquartered right in the UK, and reporters uncovered that workers making Boohoo garments were being paid as little as £3.50 an hour.
Which is less than half the UK legal minimum wage.
Exactly, in cramped, unsafe conditions during the pandemic, and this wasn't happening in a distant hemisphere. These factories were in Leicester, just miles away from Boohoo's actual headquarters.
And the financial impact was just immediate and brutal. Boohoo saw 40% of its stock value evaporate almost overnight.
Over £1 billion in market capitalization just wiped out. So how does a modern, publicly traded brand end up with sweatshops in its own backyard without even knowing it?
Well, it comes down to the actual mechanics of fast fashion. Brands demand hyper-fast turnaround times to capitalize on microtrends, right? So they push a massive urgent order onto a Tier 1 supplier. But that primary supplier legally cannot meet the deadline with their existing workforce.
So what do they do?
To keep the contract, they secretly farm out the overflow production to unauthorized shadow workshops operating out of local garages and rundown buildings.
And the brand has no idea.
None. The brand only audits the primary Tier 1 factory and remains completely blind to the shadow workshops doing the actual labor just down the street.
It's a fundamental failure of governance. And when £1 billion vanishes overnight because of a blind spot like that, corporate boards obviously panic.
Oh, they panic hard.
And that panic leads to action, though. Not always the right kind of action. Brands become desperate to show they are managing the risk, which brings us to the 3 categories of corporate action we found in the research: value, cost, and theater.
This is an incredibly useful lens for evaluating literally any sustainability claim.
Let's break it down.
Sure. So value means an action creates real structural improvement for workers and builds operational resilience for the business itself.
Okay, real change.
Exactly. Then cost refers to actions required simply to maintain a legal license to operate like mandatory reporting. It has to be done, but doesn't necessarily generate a return.
And then you have theater.
Yes. Theater.
It's such a perfect term for most corporate sustainability reports.
It really is. Theater encompasses actions that look highly rigorous in a PR brochure, but change absolutely nothing on the ground.
Right.
So a comprehensive code of conduct that is never actively enforced, that's theater. A pre-announced factory audit where everything is staged for the inspector. Pure theater.
You know, it's the equivalent of buying a gym membership that you never actually use.
I love that analogy.
It looks great on your bank statement. You can brag to your friends about your commitment to fitness, but your physical reality hasn't changed at all. Your muscles are exactly the same.
That is exactly what's happened.
And there's a devastating example of this theater in action, which is the West African cocoa industry.
Right. So Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana cultivate roughly 60 to 70% of the world's cocoa supply.
A massive chunk of the market.
Huge. And for decades, massive global chocolate conglomerates have faced intense public pressure regarding child labor on these smallholder farms.
And what was their response?
Their primary response was to lean heavily into certification. You know, those glossy little labels you see on the wrapper that say ethically sourced or fair trade.
They poured an absolute fortune into those labels. The source material notes chocolate firms spent an estimated $215 million over 2 decades on certification programs designed to eradicate child labor.
$215 million.
Yeah, and what did $215 million actually buy them? Today, roughly 1.5 million children are still working in West African cocoa production, and the vast majority are performing hazardous tasks.
It's a failure of the model. Because certifications fail due to their underlying mechanics, they often rely on point-in-time sampling.
Right, like an auditor checking just a tiny fraction of the farms.
Exactly. An auditor might check, say, 5% of the farms in a cooperative once a year. So the certification label gives consumers peace of mind at the supermarket, sure, but it does absolutely nothing to alter the structural household poverty.
That living wage gap we talked about earlier.
Precisely. It doesn't fix the gap that forces those children onto the farms in the first place.
So imagine you are a supply chain manager. You bypass the theater, you dig deep into Tier 3, and you actually uncover severe forced labor or child labor. What do? This brings up what's known as the manager's dilemma. Do you audit, engage, or exit?
Well, since we've established that audits are frequently compromised and largely theater, the real painful choice is between engaging and exiting.
And the immediate corporate instinct, usually driven by the legal and PR departments, is just to exit, right?
Almost always. Drop the supplier immediately, cancel the contracts, publish a bold statement reaffirming your zero-tolerance policy, and find a new vendor.
Clean hands. The brand protects its reputation, but what actually happens to the workers on the ground when they do that?
The exit strategy is disastrous for the workers.
Really?
Yeah, dropping a bad supplier might protect the brand's stock price, but it completely abandons the victims. The workers either lose their primary source of income entirely, or the factory simply pivots and sells its capacity to a less scrupulous buyer.
Someone who cares even less about labor rights.
Exactly. Furthermore, by walking away, the brand surrenders any commercial leverage they had to actually force the supplier to improve.
So the alternative is to engage.
And engaging is where real value is created. It means staying in the relationship, but utilizing your purchasing power as leverage to mandate structural changes.
That sounds complicated.
It is. It involves helping the supplier build management capacity, ensuring workers have anonymous grievance channels, and critically, paying a higher farm gate price so the root cause of poverty is actually addressed.
Which takes time and money.
It is a slow, messy, expensive process. It definitely doesn't fit neatly into a glossy annual report, but it is the only strategy that actually alters the reality on the ground.
But the thing is, for the last 2 decades, we've relied on companies voluntarily choosing to engage. And because voluntary actions in the theater of certifications have failed so spectacularly, governments are fundamentally changing the rules of the game.
They really are. They are no longer asking politely. They are deploying the law.
So what does this all mean? The regulatory landscape has experienced a profound shift, hasn't it?
A massive shift. We are moving away from an era of voluntary disclosure into a hardline era of mandatory due diligence. Legislators are now attaching severe, quantifiable financial penalties to the deepest tiers of the supply chain.
And the research outlines 3 distinct geographic philosophies driving this new wave of legislation. So let's start with the UK. Their approach is essentially disclose.
Right. So the UK's Modern Slavery Act of 2015 requires large firms to publicly report on the steps they are taking to eradicate supply chain slavery.
But there's a catch.
Yeah, it mandates transparency, but crucially, it does not legally compel a company to actually fix the problems they find. They just have to report on them.
Okay, then you cross the channel to the EU, and their philosophy is radically different. It's prevent and mitigate. And they have constructed this dense 3-layered approach to force compliance.
The EU framework is by far the most structurally ambitious. So layer 1 is the ESRS, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. This dictates the precise, granular data points a company must gather about its workforce. And it extends deep into the Tier 2 and Tier 3 indirect workers.
Which is exactly the data we've established these companies currently do not have.
Precisely. They have to build a mapping infrastructure from scratch. Then layer 2 is the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive.
And what does that do?
It makes the publication of that highly specific data legally mandatory for thousands of large firms. Yeah. But the true game changer is the 3rd layer, the CSDDD. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive.
Because the CSDDD goes beyond just demanding a report. It imposes an actual legal duty to act.
Yes, it legally codifies that engage-over-exit philosophy we discussed earlier. It forces firms to actively identify, prevent, and mitigate human rights and environmental harms across their entire chain.
So you can't just cut and run.
Exactly. Under the CSDDD, immediately suspending a problematic supplier is supposed to be a measure of last resort. You are legally expected to utilize your commercial leverage to resolve the abuse.
But there is a twist here that makes planning for this incredibly frustrating for companies. The 2026 Omnibus.
Ah, yes, the Omnibus.
The EU actually scaled back the CSDDD significantly at the last minute. They raised the threshold so it only applies to much larger companies, like those with over 5,000 employees and 1.5 billion euros in global turnover. And they delayed the implementation timeline.
Which was a big surprise to many.
Right. So if I am a supply chain executive trying to build out these massive mapping systems, but the laws keep changing, like the 2026 Omnibus softening the rules, how do I even plan for this without just throwing my hands up?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to look past the short-term political friction and focus on the undeniable trajectory.
The general direction things are heading.
Exactly. Yes, the Omnibus narrowed the immediate scope, which proves that regulations are a moving target and subject to political headwinds. But the core legal duty survived. The mechanism is in place.
It's not going away.
No, and it is not just labor laws closing in. Consider parallel environmental regimes like the EU deforestation regulation or the EUDR.
Oh, the EUDR is fascinating because it demands actual plot-level traceability.
Think about the mechanics required to achieve that. To comply with the EUDR, a company cannot just rely on a regional supplier. They have to send buyers with GPS devices out into the field to walk the perimeter of tiny individual farms.
Just to generate exact geolocation polygons.
Right. And then they bounce those coordinates against historical satellite imagery to mathematically prove that specific plot of land was not recently deforested.
That is mind-blowing. So a single West African cocoa bean now essentially carries two simultaneous legal burdens.
Yes.
You have to prove the labor harvesting it was clean under the CSDDD, and you have to prove the soil it grew in was clean under the EUDR.
Exactly. The gap between a firm's operational impact and its legal accountability is rapidly evaporating. You can no longer certify your way out of a crisis.
A glossy fair trade label just isn't an affirmative legal defense anymore.
Not at all. You must possess a thoroughly mapped chain, and you must hold the granular underlying data to prove it in a court of law.
Which perfectly brings us to the third philosophy, the U.S. approach, which is simply prove it.
Yes, the U.S. has largely bypassed these broad, sweeping frameworks in favor of highly targeted laws with massive immediate teeth.
Like the UFLPA.
The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. It is the prime example. It fundamentally flips the burden of proof. Customs officials operate under the legal presumption that any goods linked to the Xinjiang region of China are manufactured with forced labor.
So they are preemptively banned from entering the U.S. market.
Preemptively banned, unless the importing company can prove with exhaustive, hard evidence that their entire supply chain is clean.
And if they can't meet that burden of proof?
The shipment is seized at the border. You have no inventory to sell.
So we have officially moved from supply chain ethics or a nice PR bonus to if you don't know exactly what is happening in Tier 3, your goods will be impounded and your board will be sued.
Absolutely. Visibility has transitioned from a corporate social responsibility exercise right into the foundational core of modern financial governance.
Well, that brings us to the end of our journey today. We followed the everyday products we consume down into the unmapped, murky depths of the global supply chain.
It's a dark place.
It really is. We've examined the severe human toll and the catastrophic financial risks hidden in those blind spots, and we've seen how a new wave of rigorous global legislation is forcing corporations to abandon the theater of meaningless labels in favor of actual traceable change.
It's about time.
Definitely. So the next time you pick up a product boasting a nice certified label, you will know exactly what questions to ask about what that label might actually be hiding.
And it leaves us with one final, profound question to consider.
Let's hear it.
If international laws now demand deep, plot-level traceability and geographic distance no longer shield a parent company from legal liability or border seizures, could this signal the end of the sprawling, hyper-globalized supply chains we've built over the last half-century?
I mean, if you are going to be held legally and financially responsible for a farm 10,000 miles away that you do not even own, at what point does it simply become safer and ultimately cheaper to bring all that production right back home into your own backyard?